Chapter 13 of Mary Barton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Mary Rhodey. Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 13. A Traveller's Tales. The mermaid sat upon the rocks all day long, admiring her beauty and combing her locks, and singing a mermaid song. And hear the mermaid song you may, as sure can be, if you will but follow the sun all day, and souse with him into the sea. W.S. Landor. It was perhaps 4 or 5 days after the events mentioned in the last chapter that one evening, as Mary stood lost in reverie at the window, she saw Will Wilson enter the court, and came quickly up to her door. She was glad to see him, for he had always been a friend of hers, perhaps too much like her in character ever to become anything nearer or dearer. She opened the door in readiness to receive his frank greeting, which she as frankly returned. "Come, Mary, on with bonnet and shawl, or whatever rigging you women require before leaving the house. I'm sent to fetch you, and I can't lose time when I'm under orders." "Where am I to go to?" asked Mary, as her heart leaped up at the thought of who might be waiting for her. "Not very far," replied he, "only to old Job Legh's round the corner there. Aunt would have me come and see these new friends of hers, and then we meant to have come on here to see you and your father, but the old gentleman seems inclined to make a night of it, and have you all there. Where is your father? I want to see him. He must come too." "He's out, but I'll leave word next door for him to follow me. That's to say, if he comes home afore long," she added hesitatingly. "Is anyone else at Job's?" "No, my Aunt Jane would not come, for some maggot or other. And as for Jem, I don't know what you've all been doing to him, but he's as downhearted a chap as I'd wish to see. He's had his sorrow sure enough, poor lad, but it's time for him to be shaking off his dull looks and not go moping like a girl." "Then he's come fra Halifax, is he?" asked Mary. "Yes, his body's come, but I think he's left his heart behind him. His tongue I'm sure he has, as we used to say to childer, when they would not speak. I try to rouse him up a bit, and I think he likes having me with him, but still he's as gloomy and as dull as can be. 'Twas only yesterday he took me to the works, and you'd ha' thought us 2 Quakers as the spirit hadn't moved. All the way down we were so mum. It's a place to craze a man, certainly. Such a noisy black hole. There were 1 or 2 things worth looking at, the bellows for instance, or the gale they called a bellows. I could ha' stood near it a whole day, and if I'd a berth in that place, I should like to be bellows man, if there is such a one. But Jem weren't diverted even with that. He stood as grave as a judge while it blew my hat out of my hand. He's lost all relish for his food too, which frets my aunt sadly. Come, Mary, aren't you ready?" She had not been able to gather if she were to see Jem at Job Legh's, but when the door was opened she at once saw and felt he was not there. The evening then would be a blank, at least so she thought for the first 5 minutes. But she soon forgot her disappointment in the cheerful meeting of old friends, all except herself with some cause for rejoicing at that very time. Margaret, who would not be idle, was knitting away, with her face looking full into the room away from her work. Alice sat meek and patient with her dimmed eyes and gentle look, trying to see and to hear, but never complaining. Indeed, in her inner self she was blessing God for her happiness, for the joy of having her nephew, her child, near her, was far more present to her mind than her deprivations of sight and hearing. Job was in the full glory of host and hostess too, for by a tacit agreement he had roused himself from his habitual abstraction, and had assumed many of Margaret's little household duties. While he moved about he was deep in conversation with the young sailor, trying to extract from him any circumstances connected with the natural history of the different countries he had visited. "Oh, if you are fond of grubs and flies and beetles, there's no place for 'em like Sierra Leone. I wish you'd have some of ours. We had rather too much of a good thing. We drank them with our drink, and could scarcely keep from eating them with our food. I never thought any folk could care for such fat green beasts as those, or I would have brought you them by the thousand. A plate full of pea soup would have been full enough for you, I dare say. It were often too full for us." "I would have given a good deal for some of 'em," said Job. "Well, I knew folk at home liked some of the queer things one meets with abroad, but I never thought they'd care for them nasty, slimy things. I were always on the lookout for a mermaid, for that, I knew, were a curiosity." "You might have looked long enough," said Job, in an undertone of contempt, which, however, the quick ears of the sailor caught. "Not so long, master, in some latitudes, as you think. It stands to reason the sea hereabouts is too cold for mermaids, for women here don't go half naked on account of climate. But I've been in lands where muslin were too hot to wear on land, and where the sea were more than milk warm, and though I'd never the good luck to see a mermaid in that latitude, I know them that has." "Do tell us about it," cried Mary. "Pooh, pooh," said Job, the naturalist. Both speeches determined Will to go on with his story. What could a fellow who had never been many miles from home know about the wonders of the deep, that he should put him down in that way? "Well, it were Jack Harris, our third mate last voyage, as many and many a time telled us all about it. You see, he were becalmed off Chatham Island, that is in the great Pacific, and a warm enough latitude for mermaids and sharks and such like perils. So some of the men took the long boat, and pulled for the island to see what it were like, and when they got near, they heard a puffing, like a creature come up to take breath. You've never heard a diver? No? Well, you've heard folks in the asthma, and it were for all the world like that. So they looked around, and what should they see but a mermaid, sitting on a rock and sunning herself. The water is always warmer when it's rough, you know, so I suppose in the calm she felt it rather chilly, and had come up to warm herself." "What was she like?" asked Mary breathlessly. Job took his pipe off the chimney-piece, and began to smoke with very audible puffs, as if the story were not worth listening to. "Oh, Jack used to say she was all the world as beautiful as any of the wax ladies in the barbers' shops. Only, Mary, there were one little difference. Her hair was bright grass green." "I should not think that was pretty," said Mary hesitatingly, as if not liking to doubt the perfection of anything belonging to such an acknowledged beauty. "Oh, but it is, when you're used to it. I always think when first we get sight of land, there's no colour so lovely as grass green. However, she had green hair sure enough, and were proud enough of it too, for she were combing it out full length when first they saw her. They all thought she were a fair prize, and maybe as good as a whale in ready money. They were whale fishers, you know. For some folk think a deal of mermaids, whatever other folk do." This was a hit at Job, who retaliated in a series of sonorous spittings and puffs. "So, as I were saying, they pulled towards her, thinking to catch her. She were all the while combing her beautiful hair, and beckoning to them, while with the other hand she held a looking-glass." "How many hands had she?" asked Job. "Two, to be sure, just like any other woman," answered Will indignantly. "Oh, I thought you said she beckoned with one hand, and combed her hair with another, and held a looking-glass with her third," said Job with provoking quietness. "No, I didn't. At least, if I did, I meant she did one thing after another, as any one but—" here he mumbled a word or two, "could understand. Well, Mary," turning very decidedly towards her, "when she saw them coming near, whether it were she grew frightened at their fowling pieces, as they had on board for a bit of shooting on the island, or whether it were she were just a fickle jade as did not rightly know her own mind, which, seeing one half of her was woman, I think myself most probably. But when they were only about 2 oars' length from the rock where she sat, down she plopped into the water, leaving nothing but her hinder end of a fish tail sticking up for a minute, and then that disappeared too." "And did they never see her again?" asked Mary. "Never so plain. The man who had the second watch one night declared he saw her swimming round the ship, and holding up her glass for him to look in. And then he saw the little cottage near Aber in Wales, where his wife lived, as plain as ever he saw it in life, and his wife standing outside shading her eyes as if she were looking for him. But Jack Harris gave him no credit, for he said he were always a bit of a romancer, and besides that were a homesick downhearted chap." "I wish they had caught her," said Mary, musing. "They got one thing as belonged to her," replied Will, "and that I've often seen with my own eyes, and I reckon it's a sure proof of the truth of their story, for them that wants proof." "What was it?" asked Margaret, almost anxious her grandfather should be convinced. "Why, in her hurry she left her comb on the rock, and one of the men spied it. So they thought that were better than nothing, and they rowed there and took it, and Jack Harris had it on board the John Cropper, and I saw him comb his hair with it every Sunday morning." "What was it like?" asked Mary eagerly, her imagination running on coral combs studded with pearls. "Why, if it had not had such a strange yarn belonging to it, you'd never ha' noticed it from any other small tooth comb." "I should rather think not," sneered Job Legh. The sailor bit his lips to keep down his anger against an old man. Margaret felt very uneasy, knowing her grandfather so well, and not daring to guess what caustic remark might come next to irritate the young sailor guest. Mary, however, was too much interested by the wonders of the deep to perceive the incredulity with which Job Legh received Wilson's account of the mermaid, and when he left off, half offended, and very much inclined not to open his lips again through the evening, she eagerly said, "Oh, do tell us something more of what you hear and see on board ship. Do, Will." "What's the use, Mary, if folk won't believe one? There are things I saw with my own eyes that some people would pish and pshaw at as if I were a baby to be put down by cross noises. But I'll tell you, Mary," with an emphasis on you, "some more of the wonders of the sea, seeing you're not too wise to believe me. I have seen a fish fly." This did stagger Mary. She had heard of mermaids as signs of inns and as sea wonders, but never of flying fish. Not so Job. He put down his pipe, and nodding his head as a token of approbation, he said, "Ay, ay, young man, now you're speaking truth." "Well, now, you'll swallow that, old gentleman. You'll credit me when I say I've seen a critter half fish, half bird, and you don't credit me when I say there be such beasts as mermaids, half fish, half woman? To me, one's just as strange as t'other." "You never saw the mermaid yourself," interposed Margaret gently. "But 'love me, love my dog' was Will Wilson's motto, only his version was 'believe me, believe Jack Harris'; and the remark was not so soothing to him as it was intended to have been. "It's the exocetus, one of the malacopterygii abdominalis," said Job, much interested. "Ay, there you go. You're one of them folks as never knows beasts unless they're called out of their names. Put 'em in Sunday clothes and you know 'em, but in their work-a-day English you never know naught about 'em. I've met wi' many o' your kidney, and if I'd ha' known it, I'd ha' christened poor Jack's mermaid with some grand gibberish of a name. Mermaidicus Jack Harrisensis. That's just like their new-fangled words. D'ye believe there's such a thing as the Mermaidicus, master?" asked Will, enjoying his own joke uncommonly, as most people do. "Not I. Tell me about the—" "Well," said Will, pleased at having excited the old gentleman's faith and credit at last, "it were on this last voyage, about a day's sail from Madeira, that one of our men—not Jack Harris, I hope?" murmured Job. "Called me," continued Will, not noticing the interruption, "to see the what-d'ye-call-it flying fish, I say it is. It were 20 feet out of water, and it flew near on to 100 yards. But I say, old gentleman, I ha' gotten one dried, and if you'll take it, why, I'll give it to you. Only," he added in a lower tone, "I wish you'd just gimme credit for the Mermaidicus." I really believe, if the assuming faith in the story of the mermaid had been made the condition of receiving the flying fish, Job Legh, sincere man as he was, would have pretended belief, he was so much delighted at the idea of possessing the specimen. He won the sailor's heart by getting up to shake both hands in his vehement gratitude, puzzling poor old Alice, who yet smiled through her wonder, for she understood the action to indicate some kindly feeling towards her nephew. Job wanted to prove his gratitude, and was puzzled how to do it. He feared the young man would not appreciate any of his duplicate aranades, not even the great American Miguel, one of his most precious treasures, or else he would gladly have bestowed any duplicate on the donor of a real dried Exocetus. What would he do for him? He could ask Margaret to sing. Other folks besides her old doting grandfather thought a deal of her songs. So Margaret began some of her noble old-fashioned songs. She knew no modern music, for which her auditors might have been thankful, but she poured her rich voice out in some of the old canzonets she had lately learned while accompanying the musical lecturer on his tour. Mary was amused to see how the young sailor sat entranced, mouth, eyes, all open in order to catch every breath of sound. His very lids refused to wink, as if afraid in that brief proverbial interval to lose a particle of the rich music that floated through the room. For the first time the idea crossed Mary's mind that it was possible the plain little sensible Margaret, so prim and demure, might have power over the heart of the handsome, dashing, spirited Will Wilson. Job, too, was rapidly changing his opinion of his new guest. The flying fish went a great way, and his undisguised admiration for Margaret's singing carried him still further. It was amusing enough to see these two, within the hour so barely civil to each other, endeavouring now to be ultra-agreeable. Will, as soon as he had taken breath, a long, deep gasping of admiration, after Margaret's song, sidled up to Job and asked him in a sort of doubting tone, "You wouldn't like a live Manx cat, would you, master?" "A what?" exclaimed Job. "I don't know its best name," said Will humbly, "but we call 'em just Manx cats. They're cats without tails." Now Job, in all his natural history, had never heard of such animals, so Will continued, "Because I'm going, afore my joining my ship, to see my mother's friends in the island, and would gladly bring you one, if so be you'd like to have it. They look as queer and out of nature as flying fish, or—" he gulped the words down that should have followed, "especially when you see 'em walking a roof-top, right agin the sky, when a cat, as is a proper cat, is sure to stick her tail stiff out behind, like a slack-rope dancer a-balancing. But these cats have no tail, cannot stick it out, which captivates some people uncommonly. If you'll allow me, I'll bring one for Miss there," jerking his head at Margaret. Job assented with grateful curiosity, wishing much to see the tailless phenomenon. "When are you going to sail?" asked Mary. I cannot justly say. Our ship's bound for America next voyage, they tell me. A messmate will let me know when her sailing day is fixed. But I've got to go to the Isle of Man first. I promised uncle last time I were in England to go this next time. I may have to hoist the Blue Peter any day, so make much of me while you have me, Mary." Job asked him if he had been in America. "Haven't I? North and South, both. This time we're bound to North. Yankee land, as we call it, where Uncle Sam lives." "Uncle who?" said Mary. "Oh, it's a way sailors have of speaking. I only mean I'm going to Boston, U.S. That's Uncle Sam." Mary did not understand, so she left him and went to sit by Alice, who could not hear conversation unless expressly addressed to her. She had sat patiently silent the greater part of the night, and now greeted Mary with a quiet smile. "Where's your father?" asked she. "I guess he's at his union. He's there most evenings." Alice shook her head, but whether it were that she did not hear, or that she did not quite approve of what she heard, Mary could not make out. She sat silently watching Alice, and regretted over her dimmed and veiled eyes, formerly so bright and speaking. As if Alice understood by some other sense what was passing in Mary's mind, she turned suddenly round and answered Mary's thought. "You're mourning for me, my dear, and there's no need, Mary. I'm as happy as a child. I sometimes think I am a child, whom the Lord is hushabying to my long sleep. For when I were a nurse girl, my missus always telled me to speak very soft and low, and to darken the room that her little one might go to sleep. And now all the noises are hushed and still to me, and the bonny earth seems dim and dark, and I know it's my father lulling me away to my long sleep. I'm very well content, and you mustn't fret for me. I've had well nigh every blessing in life I could desire." Mary thought of Alice's long-cherished, fond wish to revisit the home of her childhood, so often and often deferred, and now probably never to take place, or if it did, how changed from the fond anticipation of what it was to have been. It would be a mockery to the blind and deaf Alice. The evening came quickly to an end. There was the humble cheerful meal, and then the bustling merry farewell, and Mary was once more in the quietness and solitude of her own dingy dreary-looking home, her father still out, the fire extinguished, and her evening's task of work lying all undone upon the dresser. But it had been a pleasant little interlude to think upon. It had distracted her attention for a few hours from the pressure of many uneasy thoughts of the dark, heavy, oppressive times when sorrow and want seemed to surround her on every side; of her father, his changed and altered looks, telling her so plainly of broken health and an embittered heart; of the morrow, and the morrow beyond that, to be spent in that close monotonous workroom, with Sally Leadbitter's odious whispers hissing in her ear; and of the hunted look so full of dread from Miss Simmons' doorstep up and down the street, lest her persecuting lover should be near; for he lay in wait for her with wonderful perseverance, and of late had made himself almost hateful by the unmanly force which he had used to detain her to listen to him, and the indifference with which he exposed her to the remarks of the passers-by, any of whom might circulate reports which it would be terrible for her father to hear, and worse than death should they reach Jem Wilson. And all this she had drawn upon herself by her giddy flirting. Oh, how she loathed the recollection of the hot summer evening, when, worn out by stitching and sewing, she had loitered homewards with weary languor, and first listened to the voice of the tempter. And Jem Wilson, oh, Jem, Jem, why did you not come to receive some of the modest looks and words of love which Mary longed to give you, to try and make up for the hasty rejection which you as hastily took to be final, though both mourned over it with many tears. But day after day passed away, and patience seemed of no avail, and Mary's cry was ever the old moan of the moated grange. "Why comes he not?" she said. "I am aweary, aweary. I would that I were dead." End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of Mary Barton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mary Barton by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 14. Jem's Interview with Poor Esther. Know the temptation ere you judge the crime. Look on this tree, 'twas green and fair and graceful, yet now, save these few shoots, how dry and rotten! Thou canst not tell the cause. Not long ago, a neighbour oak, with which its roots were twined, in falling wrenched them with such cruel force, that though we covered them again with care, its beauty withered, and it pined away. So, could we look into the human breast, how oft the fatal blight that meets our view, should we trace down to the torn bleeding fibres of a too trusting heart, where it were shame, for pitying tears, to give contempt or blame. Street Walks. The month was over. The honeymoon to the newly married, the exquisite convalescence to the living mother of a living child, the first dark days of nothingness to the widow and the child bereaved, the term of penance, of hard labour, and of solitary confinement, to the shrinking, shivering, hopeless prisoner. Sick and in prison, and ye visited me. Shall you, or I, receive such blessing? I know one who will. An overseer of a foundry, an aged man, with hoary hair, has spent his Sabbaths for many years in visiting the prisoners and the afflicted in Manchester New Bailey, not merely advising and comforting, but putting means into their power of regaining the virtue and the peace they had lost, becoming himself their guarantee in obtaining employment, and never deserting those who have once asked help from him. Esther's term of imprisonment was ended. She received a good character in the governor's books. She had picked her daily quantity of oakum, had never deserved the extra punishment of the treadmill, and had been civil and decorous in her language. And once more she was out of prison. The door closed behind her with a ponderous clang, and in her desolation she felt as if shut out of home, from the only shelter she could meet with, houseless and penniless as she was, on that dreary day. But it was but for an instant that she stood there doubting. One thought had haunted her both by night and by day, with monomaniacal incessancy, and that thought was how to save Mary, her dead sister's only child, her own little pet in the days of her innocence, from following in the same downward path to vice. To whom could she speak and ask for aid? She shrank from the idea of addressing John Barton again. Her heart sank within her at the remembrance of his fierce repulsing action and far fiercer words. It seemed worse than death to reveal her condition to Mary, else she sometimes thought that this course would be the most terrible, the most efficient warning. She must speak. To that she was soul compelled. But to whom? She dreaded addressing any of her former female acquaintance, even supposing they had sense, or spirit, or interest enough to undertake her mission. To whom shall the outcast prostitute tell her tale? Who will give her help in the day of need? Hers is the leper sin, and all stand aloof dreading to be counted unclean. In her wild night wanderings she had noted the haunts and habits of many a one who little thought of a watcher in the poor forsaken woman. You may easily imagine that a double interest was attached by her to the ways and companionships of those with whom she had been acquainted in the days which, when present, she had considered hardly worked and monotonous, but which now in retrospection seemed so happy and unclouded. Accordingly she had, as we have seen, known where to meet with John Barton on that unfortunate night, which had only produced irritation in him, and a month's imprisonment to her. She had also observed that he was still intimate with the Wilsons. She had seen him walking and talking with both father and son, her old friends too, and she had shed unregarded, unvalued tears, when some one had casually told her of George Wilson's sudden death. It now flashed across her mind that to the son, to Mary's playfellow, her elder brother in the days of childhood, her tale might be told, and listened to with interest by him, and some mode of action suggested by which Mary might be guarded and saved. All these thoughts had passed through her mind while yet she was in prison, so when she was turned out, her purpose was clear, and she did not feel her desolation of freedom as she would otherwise have done. That night she stationed herself early near the foundry where she knew Jem worked. He stayed later than usual, being detained by some arrangements for the morrow. She grew tired and impatient. Many workmen had come out of the door in the long dead brick wall, and eagerly had she peered into their faces, deaf to all insult or curse. He must have gone home early. One more turn in the street, and she would go. During that turn he came out, and in the quiet of that street of workshops and warehouses, she directly heard his steps. How her heart failed her for an instant, but still she was not daunted from her purpose, painful as its fulfilment was sure to be. She laid her hand on his arm. As she expected, after a momentary glance at the person who thus endeavoured to detain him, he made an effort to shake it off, and pass on; but, trembling as she was, she had provided against this by a firm and unusual grasp. "You must listen to me, Jem Wilson," she said, with almost an accent of command. "Go away, missis, I've nought to do with you, either in hearkening or talking." He made another struggle. "You must listen," she said again, authoritatively, "for Mary Barton's sake." The spell of her name was as potent as that of the mariner's glittering eye. He listened like a 3-year child. "I know you care enough for her to wish to save her from harm." He interrupted his earnest gaze into her face, with the exclamation, "And who can yo be to know Mary Barton, or to know that she's owt to me?" There was a little strife in Esther's mind for an instant, between the shame of acknowledging herself, and the additional weight to her revelation which such acknowledgment would give. Then she spoke. "Do you remember Esther, the sister of John Barton's wife, the aunt to Mary, and the valentine I sent you last February 10 years?" "Yes, I mind her well. But you're not Esther, are you?" He looked again into her face, and seeing that indeed it was his boyhood's friend, he took her hand and shook it with a cordiality that forgot the present in the past. "Why, Esther! Where'n you been this many a year? Where'n you been wandering that we none of us could find you out?" The question was asked thoughtlessly, but answered with fierce earnestness. "Where have I been? What have I been doing? Why do you torment me with questions like these? Can you not guess? But the story of my life is wanted to give force to my speech. Afterwards I will tell it you. Nay, don't change your fickle mind now, and say you don't want to hear it. You must hear it, and I must tell it, and then see after Mary, and take care she doesn't become like me. As she's loving now, so did I love once, one above me far." She remarked not, in her own absorption, the change in Jem's breathing, the sudden clutch at the wall which told the fearfully vivid interest he took in what she said. "He was so handsome, so kind. Well, the regiment was ordered to Chester. Did I tell you he was an officer? And he could not bear to part from me, nor I from him, so he took me with him. I never thought poor Mary would have taken it so to heart. I always meant to send for her to pay me a visit when I were married, for, mark you, he promised me marriage. They all do. Then came 3 years of happiness. I suppose I ought not to have been happy, but I was. I had a little girl too, oh, the sweetest darling that ever was seen. But I must not think of her," putting her hand wildly up to her forehead, "or I shall go mad, I shall." "Don't tell me any more about yourself," said Jem, soothingly. "What! you're tired already, are you? But I will tell you, as you've asked for it. You shall hear it. I won't recall the agony of the past for nothing. I will have the relief of telling it. Oh, how happy I was!" sinking her voice into a plaintive, childlike manner. "It went like a shot through me when one day he came to me and told me he was ordered to Ireland, and must leave me behind, at Bristol we then were." Jem muttered some words. She caught their meaning, and in a pleading voice continued, "Oh, don't abuse him, don't speak a word against him. You don't know how I love him yet, when I'm sunk so low. You don't guess how kind he was. He gave me £50 before we parted, and I knew he could ill spare it. Don't, Jem, please," as his muttered indignation rose again. For her sake he ceased. "I might have done better with the money, I see now, but I didn't know the value of it then. Formerly I'd earned it easily enough at the factory, and as I had no more sensible wants, I spent it on dress and on eating. While I lived with him, I had it for asking, and £50 would, I thought, go a long way. So I went back to Chester, where I'd been so happy, and set up a small ware shop, and hired a room near. We should have done well, but alas, alas, my little girl fell ill, and I couldn't mind my shop and her too, and things grew worse and worse. I sold my goods anyhow to get money to buy her food and medicine. I wrote over and over again to her father for help, but he must have changed his quarters, for I never got an answer. The landlord seized the few bobbins and tapes I had left, for shop rent, and the person to whom the mean little room, to which we had been forced to remove, belonged, threatened to turn us out unless his rent was paid. It had run on so many weeks, and it was winter, cold bleak winter, and my child was so ill, and I was starving, and I couldn't bear to see her suffer, and forgot how much better it would be for us to die together. Oh, her moans, which money could give the means of relieving. So I went out into the street one January night. Do you think God will punish me for that?" she asked, with wild vehemence, almost amounting to insanity, and shaking Jem's arm in order to force an answer from him. But before he could shape his heart's sympathy into words, her voice had lost its wildness, and she spoke with the quiet of despair. "But it's no matter. I've done that since, which separates us as far asunder as heaven and hell can be." Her voice rose again to the sharp pitch of agony. My darling! Even after death I may not see thee, my own sweet one. She was so good, like a little angel. What is that text? I don't remember. The text mother used to teach me when I sat on her knee long ago. It begins, Blessed are the pure. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Aye, that's it. It would break mother's heart if she knew where I am now. It did break Mary's heart, you see. And now I recollect it was about her child I wanted to see you, Jem. You know Mary Barton, don't you?" said she, trying to collect her thoughts. Yes, Jem knew her. How well his beating heart could testify. "Well, there's something to do for her. I forget what. Wait a minute. Oh, she's so like my little girl," said she, raising her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, in search of the sympathy of Jem's countenance. He deeply pitied her, but oh, how he longed to recall her mind to the subject of Mary, and the lover above her in rank, and the service to be done for her sake. But he controlled himself to silence. After a while she spoke again, and in a calmer voice. "When I came to Manchester, for I couldn't stay in Chester after her death, I found you all out very soon, and yet I never thought my poor sister was dead. I suppose I wouldn't think so. I used to watch about the court where John lived, for many and many a night, and gather all I could about them from the neighbours' talk, for I never asked a question. I put this and that together, and followed one, and listened to another. Many's the time I've watched the policeman off his beat, and peeped through the chink of the window shutter to see the old room, and sometimes Mary or her father sitting up late for some reason or another. I found out Mary went to learn dressmaking, and I began to be frightened for her, for it's a bad life for a girl to be out late at night in the streets, and after many an hour of weary work they're ready to follow after any novelty that makes a little change. But I made up my mind that, bad as I was, I could watch over Mary, and perhaps keep her from harm. So I used to wait for her at nights, and follow her home, often when she little knew any one was near her. There was one of her companions I never could abide, and I'm sure that girl is at the bottom of some mischief. By and by Mary's walks homewards were not alone. She was joined soon after she came out by a man, a gentleman. I began to fear for her, for I saw she was light-hearted, and pleased with his attentions, and I thought worse of him for having such long talks with that bold girl I told you of. But I was laid up for a long time with spitting of blood, and could do nothing. I'm sure it made me worse, thinking about what might be happening to Mary, and when I came out, all was going on as before, only she seemed fonder of him than ever, and oh, Jem, her father won't listen to me. And it's you that must save Mary. You're like a brother to her, and maybe could give her advice and watch over her, and at any rate John'll hearken to you, only he's so stern and so cruel." She began to cry a little at the remembrance of his harsh words, but Jem cut her short by his hoarse, stern inquiry. "Who is this spark that Mary loves? Tell me his name." "It's young Carson, old Carson's son, that your father worked for." There was a pause. She broke the silence. "Oh, Jem, I charge you with the care of her. I suppose it would be murder to kill her, but it would be better for her to die than to live to lead such a life as I do. Do you hear me, Jem?" "Yes, I hear you. It would be better. Better we were all dead." This was said as if thinking aloud, but he immediately changed his tone and continued. "Esther, you may trust to my doing all I can for Mary. That I have determined on. And now listen to me. You loathe the life you lead, else you wouldn't speak of it as you do. Come home with me. Come to my mother. She and my Aunt Alice live together. I'll see that they give you a welcome. And to-morrow I'll see if some honest way of living can't be found for you. Come home with me." She was silent for a minute, and he hoped he had gained his point. Then she said, "God bless you, Jem, for the words you've just spoken. Some years ago you might have saved me, as I hope and trust you will yet save Mary. But it's too late now, too late," she added, with accents of deep despair. Still he did not relax his hold. "Come home," he said. "I tell you I cannot. I could not lead a virtuous life if I would. I should only disgrace you." "If you will know all," said she, as he still seemed inclined to urge her, "I must have drink. Such as live like me could not bear life if they did not drink. It's the only thing to keep us from suicide. If we did not drink, we could not stand the memory of what we have been, and the thought of what we are, for a day. If I go without food, and without shelter, I must have my dram. Oh, you don't know the awful nights I've had in prison for want of it," said she, shuddering, and glaring round with terrified eyes, as if dreading to see some spiritual creature with dim form near her. "It's so frightful to see them," whispering in tones of wildness, although so low spoken. "There they go, round and round my bed the whole night through, my mother carrying little Annie. I wonder how they got together, and Mary, and all looking at me with their sad stony eyes. Oh, Jem, it's so terrible. They don't turn back either, but pass behind the head of the bed, and I feel their eyes on me everywhere. If I creep under the clothes, I still see them, and what's worse," hissing out her word with fright, "they see me. Don't speak to me of leading a better life. I must have a drink. I cannot pass to-night without a dram. I dare not." Jem was silent from deep sympathy. Oh, could he then do nothing for her? She spoke again, but in a less excited tone, although it was thrillingly earnest. You are grieved for me. I know it better than if you told me in words. But you can do nothing for me. I am past hope. You can yet save Mary. You must. She is innocent, except for the great error of loving one above her in station. Jem, you will save her. With heart and soul, though in few words, Jem promised that if aught earthly could keep her from falling, he would do it. Then she blessed him, and bade him good night. "Stay a minute," said he, as she was on the point of departure. "I may want to speak to you again. I mun know where to find you. Where do you live?" She laughed strangely. "And do you think one sunk so low as I am has a home? Decent, good people have homes. We have none. No, if you want me, come at night, and look at the corners of the streets about here. The colder, the bleaker, the more stormy the night, the more certain you will be to find me. For then," she added, with a plaintive fall in her voice, "it's so cold sleeping in entries and on doorsteps, and I want to dram more than ever." Again she rapidly turned off, and Jem also went on his way. But before he reached the end of the street, even in the midst of the jealous anguish that filled his heart, his conscience smote him. He had not done enough to save her. One more effort, and she might have come. Nay, 20 efforts would have been well rewarded by her yielding. He turned back, but she was gone. And the tumult of his other feelings, his self-reproach, was deadened for the time. But many and many a day afterwards he bitterly regretted his omission of duty, his weariness of well-doing. Now the great thing was to reach home and solitude. Mary loved another. Oh, how should he bear it? He had thought her rejection of him a hard trial, but that was nothing now. He only remembered it to be thankful that he had not yielded to the temptation of trying his fate again. Not in actual words, but in a meeting where her manner should tell far more than words. That her sweet smiles, her dainty movements, her pretty household ways, were all to be reserved to gladden another's eyes and heart. And he must live on. That seemed the strangest. That a long life, and he knew men did live long, even with deep biting sorrow corroding at their hearts, must be spent without Mary. Nay, with the consciousness she was another's. That hell of thought he would reserve for the quiet of his own room, the dead stillness of night. He was on the threshold of home now. He entered. They were the usual faces, the usual sights. He loathed them, and then he cursed himself because he loathed them. His mother's love had taken a cross turn, because he had kept the tempting supper she had prepared for him waiting until it was nearly spoilt. Alice, her dulled senses deadening day by day, sat mutely near the fire, her happiness bounded by the consciousness of the presence of her foster child, knowing that his voice repeated what was passing to her deafened ear, that his arm removed each little obstacle to her tottering step. And Will, out of the very kindness of his heart, talked more and more merrily than ever. He saw Jem was downcast, and fancied his rattling might cheer him. At any rate, it drowned his aunt's muttered grumblings, and in some measure concealed the blank of the evening. At last bedtime came, and Will withdrew to his neighbouring lodging, and Jane and Alice Wilson had raked the fire, and fastened doors and shutters, and pattered upstairs with their tottering footsteps and shrill voices. Jem, too, went to the closet termed his bedroom. There was no bolt to the door, but by one strong effort of his right arm a heavy chest was moved against it, and he could sit down on the side of his bed and think. Mary loved another. That idea would rise uppermost in his mind, and had to be combated in all its forms of pain. It was, perhaps, no great wonder that she should prefer one so much above Jem in the external things of life. But the gentleman, why did he, with his range of choice among the ladies of the land, why did he stoop down to carry off the poor man's darling? With all the glories of the garden at his hand, why did he prefer to cull the wild rose, Jem's own fragrant wild rose? His own! Oh, never now his own, gone for evermore. Then uprose the guilty longing for blood, the frenzy of jealousy. Some one should die. He would rather Mary were dead, cold in her grave, than that she were another's. A vision of her pale sweet face, with her bright hair all bedabbled with gore, seemed to float constantly before his aching eyes. But hers were ever open, and contained, in their soft deathly look, such mute reproach. What had she done to deserve such cruel treatment from him? She had been wooed by one who Jem knew to be handsome, gay, and bright, and she had given him her love. That was all. It was the wooer who should die. Yes, die, knowing the cause of his death. Jem pictured him, and gloated on the picture, lying smitten, yet conscious, and listening to the upbraiding accusation of his murderer. How he had left his own rank, and dared to love a maiden of low degree, and oh, stinging agony of all, how she in return had loved him! Then the other nature spoke up, and bade him remember the anguish he should so prepare for Mary. At first he refused to listen to that better voice, or listened only to pervert. He would glory in her wailing grief, he would take pleasure in her desolation of heart. No, he could not, said the still small voice. It would be worse, far worse, to have caused such woe, than it was now to bear his present heavy burden. But it was too heavy, too grievous to be borne and live. He would slay himself, and the lovers should love on, and the sun shine bright, and he with his burning woeful heart would be at rest. Rest that is reserved for the people of God. Had he not promised, with such earnest purpose of soul as makes words more solemn than oaths, to save Mary from becoming such as Esther? Should he shrink from the duties of life into the cowardliness of death? Who would then guard Mary, with her love and her innocence? Would it not be a goodly thing to serve her, although she loved him not, to be her preserving angel through the perils of life, and she unconscious all the while? He braced up his soul, and said to himself that with God's help he would be that earthly keeper. And now the mists and the storms seemed clearing away from his path, though it still was full of stinging thorns. Having done the duty nearest to him, of reducing the tumult of his own heart to something like order, the second became more plain before him. Poor Esther's experience had led her, perhaps too hastily, to the conclusion that Mr. Carson's intentions were evil towards Mary. At least she had given no just ground for the fears she entertained that such was the case. It was possible, nay, to Jem's heart very probable, that he might only be too happy to marry her. She was a lady by right of nature, Jem thought, in movement, grace, and spirit. What was birth to a Manchester manufacturer, many of whom glory, and justly too, in being the architects of their own fortunes? And as far as wealth was concerned, judging another by himself, Jem could only imagine it a great privilege to lay it at the feet of the loved one. Harry Carson's mother had been a factory girl, so, after all, what was the great reason for doubting his intentions towards Mary? There might probably be some little awkwardness about the affair at first, Mary's father having such strong prejudices on the one hand, and something of the same kind being likely to exist on the part of Mr. Carson's family. But Jem knew he had power over John Barton's mind, and it would be something to exert that power in promoting Mary's happiness, and to relinquish all thought of self in so doing. Oh, why had Esther chosen him for this office? It was beyond his strength to act rightly. Why had she singled him out? The answer came when he was calm enough to listen for it. Because Mary had no other friend capable of the duty required of him, the duty of a brother, as Esther imagined him to be in feeling, from his long friendship. He would be unto her as a brother. As such, he ought to ascertain Harry Carson's intentions towards her in winning her affections. He would ask him straightforwardly, as became man speaking to man, not concealing, if need were, the interest he felt in Mary. Then, with the resolve to do his duty to the best of his power, peace came into his soul. He had left the windy storm and tempest behind. 2 hours before day dawn, he fell asleep. End of chapter 14 of Mary Barton by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell.
Chapter 15 of Mary Barton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mary Barton by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 15. A violent meeting between the rivals. What thoughtful heart can look into this gulf that darkly yawns twixt rich and poor, and not find food for saddest meditation, can see without a pang of keenest grief them fiercely battling like some natural foes, whom God had made, with help and sympathy, to stand as brothers, side by side, united. Where is the wisdom that shall bridge this gulf, and bind them once again in trust and love? Love Truths. We must return to John Barton. Poor John! He never got over his disappointing journey to London. The deep mortification he then experienced, with perhaps as little selfishness for its cause as mortification ever had, was of no temporary nature. Indeed, few of his feelings were. Then came a long period of bodily privation, of daily hunger after food, and though he tried to persuade himself he could bear want himself with social indifference, and did care about it as little as most men, yet the body took its revenge for its uneasy feelings. The mind became soured and morose, and lost much of its equipoise. It was no longer elastic as in the days of youth, or in times of comparative happiness. It ceased to hope, and it is hard to live on when one can no longer hope. The same state of feeling which John Barton entertained, if belonging to one who had leisure to think of such things, and physicians to give names to them, would have been called monomania. So haunting, so incessant, were the thoughts that pressed upon him. I have somewhere read a forcibly described punishment among the Italians, worthy of a Borgia. The supposed or real criminal was shut up in a room, supplied with every convenience and luxury, and at first mourned little over his imprisonment. But day by day he became aware that the space between the walls of his apartment was narrowing, and then he understood the end. Those painted walls would come into hideous nearness, and at last crush the life out of him. And so day by day, nearer and nearer, came the diseased thoughts of John Barton. They excluded the light of heaven, the cheering sounds of earth. They were preparing his death. It is true much of their morbid power might be ascribed to the use of opium. But before you blame too harshly this use, or rather abuse, try a hopeless life, with daily cravings of the body for food. Try not alone being without hope yourself, but seeing all around you reduced to the same despair, arising from the same circumstances, all around you telling, though they use no words or language, by their looks and feeble actions, that they are suffering and sinking under the pressure of want. Would you not be glad to forget life and its burdens? And opium gives forgetfulness for a time. It is true they who thus purchase it pay dearly for their oblivion, but can you expect the uneducated to count the cost of their whistle? Poor wretches! They pay a heavy price. Days of oppressive weariness and languor, whose realities have the feeble sickliness of dreams; nights, whose dreams are fierce realities of agony; sinking health, tottering frames, incipient madness, and worse, the consciousness of incipient madness. This is the price of their whistle. But have you taught them the science of consequences? John Barton's overpowering thought, which was to work out his fate on earth, was rich and poor. Why are they so separate, so distinct, when God has made them all? It is not his will that their interests are so far apart. Whose doing is it? And so on into the problems and mysteries of life, until, bewildered and lost, unhappy and suffering, the only feeling that remained clear and undisturbed in the tumult of his heart was hatred to the one class, and keen sympathy with the other. But what availed his sympathy? No education had given him wisdom, and without wisdom, even love, with all its effects, too often works but harm. He acted to the best of his judgment, but it was a widely erring judgment. The actions of the uneducated seem to me typified in those of Frankenstein, that monster of many human qualities, ungifted with a soul, a knowledge of the difference between good and evil. The people rise up to life, they irritate us, they terrify us, and we become their enemies. Then, in the sorrowful moment of our triumphant power, their eyes gaze on us with mute reproach. Why have we made them what they are, a powerful monster, yet without the inner means for peace and happiness? John Barton became a Chartist, a communist, all that is commonly called wild and visionary. Ay, but being visionary is something. It shows a soul, a being not altogether sensual, a creature who looks forward for others, if not for himself. And with all his weakness he had a sort of practical power, which made him useful to the bodies of men to whom he belonged. He had a ready kind of rough Lancashire eloquence, arising out of the fulness of his heart, which was very stirring to men similarly circumstanced, who liked to hear their feelings put into words. He had a pretty clear head at times, for method and arrangement, a necessary talent to large combinations of men. And what perhaps more than all made him relied upon and valued, was the consciousness which every one who came in contact with him felt, that he was actuated by no selfish motives, that his class, his order, was what he stood by, not the rights of his own paltry self. For even in great and noble men, as soon as self comes into prominent existence, it becomes a mean and paltry thing. A little time before this, there had come one of those occasions for deliberation among the employed, which deeply interested John Barton, and the discussions concerning which had caused his frequent absence from home of late. I am not sure if I can express myself in the technical terms of either masters or workmen, but I will try simply to state the case on which the latter deliberated. An order for coarse goods came in from a new foreign market. It was a large order, giving employment to all the mills engaged in that species of manufacture, but it was necessary to execute it speedily, and at as low prices as possible, as the masters had reason to believe that a duplicate order had been sent to one of the continental manufacturing towns, where there were no restrictions on food, no taxes on building or machinery, and where consequently they dreaded that the goods could be made at a much lower price than they could afford them for, and that, by so acting and charging, the rival manufacturers would obtain undivided possession of the market. It was clearly their interest to buy cotton as cheaply, and to beat down wages as low as possible, and in the long run the interests of the workmen would have been thereby benefited. Distrust each other as they may, the employers and the employed must rise or fall together. There may be some difference as to chronology, none as to fact, but the masters did not choose to make all these circumstances known. They stood upon being the masters, and that they had a right to order work at their own prices, and they believed that in the present depression of trade and unemployment of hands, there would be no great difficulty in getting it done. Now let us turn to the workmen's view of the question. The masters, of the tottering foundation of whose prosperity they were ignorant, seemed doing well, and, like gentlemen, lived at home in ease, while they were starving, gasping on from day to day, and there was a foreign order to be executed, the extent of which, large as it was greatly exaggerated, and it was to be done speedily. Why were the masters offering such low wages under these circumstances? Shame upon them! It was taking advantage of their work people being almost starved, but they would starve entirely rather than come into such terms. It was bad enough to be poor, while by the labour of their thin hands, the sweat of their brows, the masters were made rich, but they would not be utterly ground down to dust. No, they would fold their hands and sit idle, and smile at the masters, whom even in death they could baffle. With Spartan endurance they determined to let the employers know their power, by refusing to work. So class distrusted class, and their want of mutual confidence wrought sorrow to both. The masters would not be bullied, and compelled to reveal why they felt it wisest and best to offer only such low wages. They would not be made to tell that they were even sacrificing capital to obtain a decisive victory over the continental manufacturers. And the workmen sat silent and stern, with folded hands, refusing to work for such pay. There was a strike in Manchester. Of course it was succeeded by the usual consequences. Many other trades unions, connected with different branches of business, supported with money, countenance, and encouragement of every kind, the stand which the Manchester power loom weavers were making against their masters. Delegates from Glasgow, from Nottingham, and other towns, were sent to Manchester to keep up the spirit of resistance. A committee was formed, and all the requisite officers elected, chairman, treasurer, honorary secretary. Among them was John Barton. The masters meanwhile took their measure. They placarded the walls with advertisements for power loom weavers. The workmen replied by a placard in still larger letters, stating their grievances. The masters met daily in town, to mourn over the time, so fast slipping away, for the fulfilment of the foreign orders, and to strengthen each other in their resolution not to yield. If they gave up now, they might give up always. It would never do. And amongst the most energetic of the masters, the Carsons, father and son, took their places. It is well known, that there is no religionist so zealous as a convert, no masters so stern, and regardless of the interests of their work people, as those who have risen from such a station themselves. This would account for the elder Mr. Carson's determination not to be bullied into yielding, not even to be bullied into giving reasons for acting as the masters did. It was the employer's will, and that should be enough for the employed. Harry Carson did not trouble himself much about the grounds for his conduct. He liked the excitement of the affair. He liked the attitude of resistance. He was brave, and he liked the idea of personal danger, with which some of the more cautious tried to intimidate the violent among the masters. Meanwhile, the power loom weavers living in the more remote parts of Lancashire and the neighbouring counties heard of the masters' advertisements for workmen, and in their solitary dwellings grew weary of starvation, and resolved to come to Manchester. Footsore, way-worn, half-starved looking men they were, as they tried to steal into town in the early dawn, before people were astir, or in the dusk of the evening. And now began the real wrong-doing of the trades unions. As to their decision to work, or not, at such a particular rate of wages, that was either wise or unwise, all error of judgment at the worst. But they had no right to tyrannize over others, and tie them down to their own procrustine bed, abhorring what they considered oppression in the masters. Why did they oppress others? Because when men get excited, they know not what they do. Judge then, with something of the mercy of the Holy One, whom we all love. In spite of policemen set to watch over the safety of the poor country weavers, in spite of magistrates, and prisons and severe punishments, the poor depressed men tramping in from Burnley, Padiham, and other places, to work at the condemned starvation prices, were waylaid and beaten, and left by the roadside almost for dead. The police broke up every lounging knot of men. They separated quietly, to reunite half a mile out of town. Of course, the feeling between the masters and the workmen did not improve under these circumstances. Combination is an awful power. It is like the equally mighty agency of steam, capable of almost unlimited good or evil. But to obtain a blessing on its labours, it must work under the direction of a high and intelligent will, incapable of being misled by passion or excitement. The will of the operatives had not been guided to the calmness of wisdom. So much for generalities. Let us now return to individuals. A note, respectfully worded, although its tone of determination was strong, had been sent by the power loom weavers, requesting that a deputation of them might have a meeting with the masters, to state the conditions they must have fulfilled before they would end the turnout. They thought they had attained a sufficiently commanding position to dictate. John Barton was appointed one of the deputation. The masters agreed to this meeting, being anxious to end the strife, although undetermined among themselves how far they should yield, or whether they should yield at all. Some of the old, whose experience had taught them sympathy, were for concession. Others, white-headed men too, had only learnt hardness and obstinacy from the days of the years of their lives, and sneered at the more gentle and yielding. The younger men were one and all for an unflinching resistance to claims urged with so much violence. Of this party, Harry Carson was the leader. But like all energetic people, the more he had to do, the more time he seemed to find. With all his letter writing, his calling, his being present at the New Bailey when investigations of any case of violence against knobsticks were going on, he beset Mary more than ever. She was weary of her life for him. From blandishments he had even gone to threats that whether she would or not she should be his. He showed an indifference that was most insulting to everything which might attract attention and injure her character. Knobsticks, those who consent to work at lower wages. And still she never saw Jem. She knew he had returned home. She heard of him occasionally through his cousin, who roved gaily from house to house, finding and making friends everywhere. But she never saw him. What was she to think? Had he given her up? Were a few hasty words, spoken in a moment of irritation, to stamp her lot through life? At times she thought that she could bear this meekly, happy in her own constant power of loving. For of change or of forgetfulness she did not dream. Then at other times her state of impatience was such, that it required all her self-restraint to prevent her from going and seeking him out, and, as man would do to man or woman to woman, begging him to forgive her hasty words, and allow her to retract them, and bidding him accept of the love that was filling her whole heart. She wished Margaret had not advised her against such a manner of proceeding. She believed it was her friend's words that seemed to make such a simple action impossible, in spite of all the internal urgings. But a friend's advice is only thus powerful, when it puts into language the secret oracle of our souls. It was the whisperings of her womanly nature that caused her to shrink from any unmaidenly action, not Margaret's counsel. All this time, this 10 days or so, of Will's visit to Manchester, there was something going on which interested Mary even now, and which, in former times, would have exceedingly amused and excited her. She saw as clearly as if told in words that the merry, random, boisterous sailor had fallen deeply in love with the quiet, prim, somewhat plain Margaret. She doubted if Margaret was aware of it, and yet, as she watched more closely, she began to think some instinct made the blind girl feel whose eyes were so often fixed upon her pale face, that some inner feeling made the delicate and becoming rose-flush steal over her countenance. She did not speak so decidedly as before. There was a hesitation in her manner that seemed to make her very attractive, as if something softer, more lovable than excellent sense, were coming in as a motive for speech. Her eyes had always been soft, and were in no ways disfigured by her blindness, and now seemed to have a new charm, as they quivered under their white downcast lids. She must be conscious, thought Mary, heart answering to heart. Will's love had no blushings, no downcast eyes, no weighing of words. It was as open and undisguised as his nature, yet he seemed afraid of the answer its acknowledgment might meet with. It was Margaret's angelic voice that had entranced him, and which made him think of her as a being of some other sphere that he feared to woo. So he tried to propitiate Job in all manner of ways, He went over to Liverpool to rummage in his great sea chest for the flying fish. No very odorous present, by the way. He hesitated over a child's call for some time, which was, in his eyes, a far greater treasure than any exotes. What use could it be of to a landsman? Then Margaret's voice rang in his ears, and he determined to sacrifice it, his most precious possession, to one whom she loved as she did her grandfather. It was rather a relief to him, when, having put it and the flying fish together in a brown paper parcel, and sat upon them for security all the way in the railroad, he found that Job was so indifferent to the precious call, that he might easily claim it again. He hung about Margaret, till he had received many warnings and reproaches from his conscience in behalf of his dear Aunt Alice's claims upon his time. He went away. Then he bethought him of some other little word with Job, and he turned back and stood talking once more in Margaret's presence, door in hand, only waiting for some little speech of encouragement to come in and sit down again. But as the invitation was not given, he was forced to leave at last and go and do his duty. 4 days had Jem Wilson watched for Mr. Harry Carson, without success. His hours of going and returning to his home were so irregular, owing to the meetings and consultations among the masters, which were rendered necessary by the turn-out. On the 5th, without any purpose on Jem's part, they met. It was the workmen's dinner hour, the interval between 12 and 1, when the streets of Manchester are comparatively quiet, for a few shopping ladies and lounging gentlemen count for nothing in that busy, bustling living place. Jem had been on an errand for his master. Instead of returning to his dinner, and in passing along a lane, a road, called, in compliment to the intentions of some future builder and street, he encountered Harry Carson, the only person, as far as he saw, beside himself, treading the unfrequented path. Along one side ran a high broad fence, blackened over by coal tar, and spiked and stuck with pointed nails at the top, to prevent anyone from climbing over into the garden beyond. By this fence was the footpath. The carriage road was such as no carriage, no, not even a cart, could possibly have passed along without Hercules to assist in lifting it out of the deep clay ruts. On the other side of the way was a dead brick wall, and a field after that, where there was a saw-pit and joiner's shed. Jem's heart beat violently when he saw the gay, handsome young man approaching, with a light, buoyant step. This, then, was he whom Mary loved. It was, perhaps, no wonder, for he seemed to the poor smith so elegant, so well appointed, that he felt the superiority in externals, strangely and painfully for an instant. Then something uprose within him, and told him that a man's a man for a that, and twice as much as a that. And he no longer felt troubled by the outward appearance of his rival. Harry Carson came on, lightly bounding over the dirty places with almost a lad's buoyancy. To his surprise the dark, sturdy-looking artisan stopped him by saying respectfully, "May I speak a word with you, sir?" "Certainly, my good man," looking his astonishment, then finding that the promised speech did not come very quickly, he added, "But make haste, for I'm in a hurry." Jem had cast about for some less abrupt way of broaching the subject uppermost in his mind, than he now found himself obliged to use. With a husky voice that trembled as he spoke, he said, "I think, sir, you're keeping company with a young woman called Mary Barton." A light broke in upon Henry Carson's mind, and he paused before he gave the answer for which the other waited. Could this man be a lover of Mary's? And, strange stinging thought, could he be beloved by her, and so have caused her obstinate rejection of himself? He looked at Jem from head to foot, a black, grimy mechanic, in dirty fustian clothes, strongly built, and awkward, according to the dancing master. Then he glanced at himself, and recalled the reflection he had so lately quitted in his bedroom. It was impossible. No woman with eyes could choose the one when the other wooed. It was Hyperion to a satyr. That quotation came aptly. He forgot that a man's a man for a' that. And yet there was a clue, which he had often wanted, to her changed conduct towards him. If she loved this man, if he hated the fellow, and longed to strike him, he would know all. Mary Barton, let me see. Aye, that is the name of the girl. An arrant flirt the little hussy is, but very pretty. Aye, Mary Barton is her name. Jem bit his lips. Was it then so that Mary was a flirt, the giddy creature of whom he spoke? He would not believe it, and yet how he wished the suggestive words unspoken. That thought must keep now, though. Even if she were, the more reason for there being someone to protect her, poor faulty darling. She's a good girl, sir, though maybe a bit set up with her beauty, but she's her father's only child, sir, and—" He stopped. He did not like to express suspicion, and yet he was determined he would be certain there was ground for none. What should he say? "Well, my fine fellow, and what have I to do with that? It's but loss of my time and yours too, if you've only stopped me to tell me Mary Barton is very pretty. I know that well enough." He seemed as though he would have gone on, but Jem put his black, working right hand upon his arm to detain him. The haughty young man shook it off, and with his glove pretended to brush away the sooty contamination that might be left upon his light great-coat sleeve. The little action aroused Jem. "I will tell you in plain words what I have got to say to you, young man. It's been telled me by one as knows, and has seen, that you walk with this same Mary Barton, and are known to be courting her, and her as spoke to me about it thinks as how Mary loves you. That may be or may not, but I'm an old friend of hers and her father's, and I just wish to know if you mean to marry the girl. Spite of what you said of her lightness, I had known her long enough to be sure she'll make a noble wife for anyone, let him be what he may, and I mean to stand by her like a brother, and if you mean rightly, you'll not think the worst on me for what I've now said, and if, but no, I'll not say what I'll do to the man who wrongs a hair of her head. He shall rue it to the longest day he lives, that's all. Now, sir, what I ask of you is this. If you mean fair and honourable by her, well and good, but if not, for your own sake as well as hers, leave her alone, and never speak to her more." Jem's voice quivered with the earnestness with which he spoke, and he eagerly waited for some answer. Harry Carson, meanwhile, instead of attending very particularly to the purpose the man had in addressing him, was trying to gather from his speech what was the real state of the case. He succeeded so far as to comprehend that Jem inclined to believe that Mary loved his rival, and consequently that if the speaker were attached to her himself, he was not a favoured admirer. The idea came into Mr. Carson's mind that perhaps, after all, Mary loved him in spite of her frequent and obstinate rejections, and that she had employed this person, whoever he was, to bully him into marrying her. He resolved to try and ascertain more correctly the man's relation to her. Either he was a lover, and if so, not a favoured one, in which case Mr. Carson could not at all understand the man's motives for interesting himself in securing her marriage, or he was a friend, and an accomplice, whom she had employed to bully him. So little faith in goodness have the mean and selfish. "Before I make you into my confidant, my good man," said Mr. Carson, in a contemptuous tone, "I think it might be as well to inquire your right to meddle with our affairs. Neither Mary nor I, as I conceive, called you in as a mediator." He paused. He wanted a distinct answer to the last supposition. None came, so he began to imagine he was to be threatened into some engagement, and his angry spirit rose. "And so, my fine fellow, you will have the kindness to leave us to ourselves, and not to meddle with what does not concern you. If you were a brother or a father of hers, the case might have been different. As it is, I can only consider you an impertinent meddler." Again he would have passed on, but Jem stood in a determined way before him, saying, "You say if I had been her brother or her father, you'd have answered me what I ask. Now, neither father nor brother could love her as I have loved her, ay, and as I love her still. If love gives a right to satisfaction, it's next to impossible anyone breathing can come up to my right. Now, sir, tell me, do you mean fair by Mary or not? I've proved my claim to know, and by G, I will know." "Come, come, no impudence," replied Mr. Carson, who, having discovered what he wanted to know, namely, that Jem was a lover of Mary's, and that she was not encouraging his suit, wished to pass on, father, brother, or rejected lover, with an emphasis on the word rejected. "No one has a right to interfere between my little girl and me. Not one shall. Confound you, man, get out of my way, or I'll make you," as Jem still obstructed his path with dogged determination. "I won't, then, till you've given me your word about Mary," replied the mechanic, grinding his words out between his teeth, and the livid paleness of the anger he could no longer keep down covering his face till he looked ghastly. "Won't you?" with a taunting laugh. "Then I'll make you." The young man raised his slight cane, and smote the artisan across the face with a stinging stroke. An instant afterwards he lay stretched in the muddy road, Jem standing over him, panting with rage. What he would have done next in his moment of ungovernable passion no one knows, but a policeman from the main street, into which this road led, had been sauntering about for some time, unobserved by the either of the parties, and expecting some kind of conclusion like the present to the violent discussion going on between the two young men. In a minute he had pinioned Jem, who sullenly yielded to the surprise. Mr. Carson was on his feet directly, his face glowing with rage or shame. "Shall I take him to the lock-up for assault, sir?" said the policeman. "No, no," exclaimed Mr. Carson. "I struck him first. It was no assault on his side, though. he continued, hissing out his words to Jem, who even hated freedom procured for him, however justly, at the intervention of his rival. "I will never forgive or forget insult. Trust me." He gasped the words in excess of passion. "Mary shall fare no better for your insolent interference." He laughed, as if with the consciousness of power. Jem replied with equal excitement, "And if you dare to injure her in the least, I will wait you where no policeman can step in between, and God shall judge between us two." The policeman now interfered with persuasions and warnings. He locked his arm in Jem's to lead him away in an opposite direction to that in which he saw Mr. Carson was going. Jem submitted gloomily for a few steps, then wrenched himself free. The policeman shouted after him, "Take care, my man. There's no girl on earth worth what you'll be bringing on yourself if you don't mind." But Jem was out of hearing. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of Mary Barton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Daly, Washington, D.C. Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 16. Meeting between Masters and Workmen. Not for a moment take the scorner's chair. While seated there, thou know'st not a word. A tone, a look, may gall thy brother's heart, and make him turn in bitterness against thee. Love truths. The day arrived on which the masters were to have an interview with the deputation of the workpeople. The meeting was to take place in a public room at an hotel, and there about 11 o'clock the mill owners who had received the foreign orders began to collect. Of course, the first subject, however full their minds might be of another, was the weather. Having done their duty by all the showers and sunshine which had occurred during the past week, they fell to talking about the business which had brought them together. There might be about 20 gentlemen in the room, including some by courtesy who were not immediately concerned in the settlement of the present question, but who, nevertheless, were sufficiently interested to attend. These were divided into little groups, who did not seem by any means unanimous. Some were for a slight concession, just a sugar-plum to quieten the naughty children, a sacrifice to peace and quietness. Some were steadily and vehemently opposed to the dangerous precedent of yielding one jot or one tittle to the outward force of a turnout. It was teaching the workpeople how to become masters, said they. Did they want the wildest thing hereafter, they would know that the way to obtain their wishes would be to strike work. Besides, one or two of those present had only just returned from the New Bailey, where one of the turnouts had been tried for a cruel assault on a poor north country weaver who had attempted to work at the low price. They were indignant, and justly so, at the merciless manner in which the poor fellow had been treated, and their indignation at wrong took, as it often does, the extreme form of revenge. They felt as if, rather than yield to the body of men who were resorting to such cruel measures towards their fellow workmen, they, the masters, would sooner relinquish all the benefits to be derived from the fulfilment of the commission, in order that the workmen might suffer keenly. They forgot that the strike was, in this instance, the consequence of want and need, suffered unjustly, as the endurers believed. For, however insane, and without ground of reason, such was their belief, and such was the cause of their violence. It is a great truth that you cannot extinguish violence by violence. You may put it down for a time, but while you are crowing over your imaginary success, see if it does not return with 7 devils worse than its former self. No one thought of treating the workmen as brethren and friends, and openly, clearly, as appealing to reasonable men, stating exactly and fully the circumstances which led the masters to think it was the wise policy of the time to make sacrifices themselves and to hope for them from the operatives. In going from group to group in the room, you caught such a medley of sentences as the following. Poor devils, they're near enough to starving, I'm afraid. Mrs. Aldred makes 2 cows' heads into soup every week, and people come many miles to fetch it, and if these times last we must try and do more. But we must not be bullied into anything. A rise of a shilling or so won't make much difference, and they will go away thinking they've gained their point. And that's the very thing I object to. They'll think so, and whenever they've got a point to gain, no matter how unreasonable, they'll strike work. It really injures them more than us. I don't see how our interests can be separated. The demmed brute had thrown vitriol on the poor fellow's ankles, and you know what a bad part that is to heal. He had to stand still with the pain, and that left him at the mercy of the cruel wretch, who beat him about the head till you'd hardly have known he was a man. They doubt if he'll live. If it were only for that, I'll stand out against them, even if it is the cause of my ruin. I for one won't yield 1 farthing to the cruel brutes. They're more like wild beasts than human beings. Well, who might have made them different? I say, Carson, just go and tell Duncombe of this fresh instance of their abominable conduct. He's wavering, but I think this will decide him. The door was now opened, and the waiter announced that the men were below, and asked if it were the pleasure of the gentlemen that they should be shown up. They assented, and rapidly took their places round the official table, looking as like they could to the Roman senators who awaited the eruption of Brennus and his Gauls. Tramp, tramp, came the heavy clogged feet up the stairs, and in a minute 5 wild, earnest-looking men stood in the room. John Barton, from some mistake as to time, was not among them. Had they been larger-boned men, you would have called them gaunt. As it was, they were little of stature, and their fustian clothes hung loosely about their shrunk limbs. In choosing their delegates, too, the operatives had had more regard to their brains and power of speech than to their wardrobes. They might have read the opinions of that worthy Professor Trufelstreck in Sartor Resartus, to judge from the dilapidated coats and trousers which yet clothed men of parts and of power. It was long since many of them had known the luxury of a new article of dress, and air gaps were to be seen in their garments. Some of the masters were rather affronted at such a ragged detachment coming between the wind and their nobility, but what cared they? At the request of a gentleman hastily chosen to officiate as chairman, the leader of the delegates read, in a high-pitched, psalm-singing voice, a paper containing the operatives' statement of the case at issue, their complaints, and their demands, which last were not remarkable for moderation. He was then desired to withdraw for a few minutes with his fellow delegates to another room, while the masters considered what should be their definite answer. When the men had left the room, a whispered, earnest consultation took place, every one re-urging his former arguments. The conceders carried the day, but only by a majority of 1. The minority haughtily and audibly expressed their dissent from the measures to be adopted. Even after the delegates re-entered the room, their words and looks did not pass unheeded by the quick-eyed operatives. Their names were registered in bitter hearts. The masters would not consent to the advance demanded by the workmen. They would agree to give 1 shilling per week more than they had previously offered. Were the delegates empowered to accept such an offer? They were empowered to accept or decline any offer made that day by the masters. Then it might be as well for them to consult among themselves as to what should be their decision. They again withdrew. It was not for long. They came back, and positively declined any compromise of their demands. Then up sprang Mr. Henry Carson, the head and voice of the violent party among the masters, and addressing the chairman, even before the scowling operatives, he proposed some resolutions which he, and those who agreed with him, had been concocting during this last absence of the deputation. They were, firstly, withdrawing the proposal just made, and declaring all communication between the masters and that particular trades union at an end. Secondly, declaring that no master would employ any workman in future unless he signed a declaration that he did not belong to any trades union, and pledged himself not to assist or subscribe to any society having for its object interference with the master's powers. And thirdly, that the masters should pledge themselves to protect and encourage all workmen willing to accept employment on those conditions, and at the rate of wages first offered. Considering that the men who now stood listening with lowered brows of defiance were all of them leading members of the Union, which resolutions were in themselves sufficiently provocative of animosity, but not content with simply stating them, Harry Carson went on to characterize the conduct of the workmen in no measured terms, every word he spoke rendering their looks more livid, their glaring eyes more fierce. One among them would have spoken, but checked himself, in obedience to the stern glance and pressure on his arm received from the leader. Mr. Carson sat down, and a friend instantly got up to second the motion. It was carried, but far from unanimously. The chairman announced it to the delegates, who had been once more turned out of the room for a division. They received it with deep, brooding silence, but spake never a word, and left the room without even a bow. Now, there had been some by-play at this meeting, not recorded in the Manchester newspapers, which gave an account of the more regular part of the transaction. While the men had stood grouped near the door on their first entrance, Mr. Harry Carson had taken out his silver pencil and had drawn an admirable caricature of them, lank, ragged, dispirited, and famine-stricken. Underneath he wrote a hasty quotation from the fat knight's well-known speech in Henry IV. He passed it to one of his neighbours, who acknowledged the likeness instantly, and by him it was sent round to others, who all smiled and nodded their heads, and when it came back to its owner, he tore the back of the letter on which it was drawn in two, twisted them up, and flung them into the fireplace. But, careless whether they reached their aim or not, he did not look to see that they fell just short of any consuming cinders. This proceeding was closely observed by one of the men. He watched the masters as they left the hotel, laughing, some of them were, at passing jokes. And when all had gone, he re-entered. He went to the waiter, who recognized him. "There's a bid on a picture up yonder, as one of the gentlemen threw away. I've a little lad at home as dearly loves a picture. By your leave, I'll go up for it." The waiter, good-natured and sympathetic, accompanied him upstairs, saw the paper, picked it up, and untwisted. And then, being convinced, by a hasty glance at its contents, that it was only what the man had called it, a bit of a picture, he allowed him to bear away his prize. Towards 7 o'clock that evening, many operatives began to assemble in a room in the Weaver's Arms public house, a room appropriated for festive occasions, as the landlord in his circular on opening the premises had described it. But, alas, it was on no festive occasion that they met there this night. Starved, irritated, despairing men, they were assembled to hear the answer that morning given by the masters to their delegates, after which, as was stated in the notice, a gentleman from London would have the honour of addressing the meeting on the present state of affairs between the employers and the employed, or, as he chose to term them, the idle and the industrious classes. The room was not large, but its bareness of furniture made it appear so. The unshaded gas flared down on the lean and unwashed artisans as they entered, their eyes blinking in the excess of light. They took their seats on benches and awaited the deputation. The latter gloomily and ferociously delivered the master's ultimatum, adding thereto not one word of their own, and it sank all the deeper into the sore hearts of the listeners for their forbearance. Then the gentleman from London, who had been previously informed of the master's decision, entered. You would have been puzzled to define his exact position, or what was the state of his mind as regarded education. He looked so self-conscious, so far from earnest, among the group of eager, fierce, absorbed men whom he now stood. He might have been a disgraced medical student in the Bob Sawyer class, or an unsuccessful actor, or a flashy shopman. The impression he would have given you would have been unfavourable, and yet there was much about him that could only be characterized as doubtful. He smirked in acknowledgment of their uncouth greetings, and sat down. Then, glancing around, he inquired whether it would not be agreeable to the gentlemen present to have pipes and liquor handed round, adding that he would stand treat. As the man who has had his taste educated to love reading falls devouringly upon books after a long absence, so these poor fellows, whose tastes had been left to educate themselves into a liking for tobacco, beer, and similar gratifications, gleamed up at the proposal of the London delegate. And tobacco and drink deaden the pangs of hunger, and make one forget the miserable home, the desolate future. They were now ready to listen to him with approbation. He felt it, and rising like a great orator, with his right arm outstretched, his left in the breast of his waistcoat, he began to declaim with a forced theatrical voice. After a burst of eloquence, in which he blended the deeds of the elder and the younger Brutus, and magnified the resistless might of the millions of Manchester, the Londoner descended to matter-of-fact business, and in his capacity this way he did not belie the good judgment of those who had sent him as a delegate. Masses of people, when left to their own free choice, seem to have discretion in distinguishing men of natural talent. It is a pity that so little regard temper and principles. He rapidly dictated resolutions and suggested measures. He wrote out a stirring placard for the walls. He proposed sending delegates to entreat the assistance of other trades unions in other towns. He headed the list of subscribing unions by a liberal donation from that with which he was especially connected in London. And what was more and more uncommon, he paid down the money in real, clinking, blinking golden sovereigns. The money, alas, was cravingly required, but before alleviating any private necessities on the morrow, small sums were handed to each of the delegates, who were in a day or two to set out on their expeditions to Glasgow, Newcastle, Nottingham, etc. These men were most of them members of the deputation who had that morning waited upon the masters. After he had drawn up some letters, and spoken a few more stirring words, the gentleman from London withdrew, previously shaking hands all around, and many speedily following him out of the room and out of the house. The newly appointed delegates and one or two others remained behind to talk over their respective missions, and to give and exchange opinions in more homely and natural language than they dared to use before the London orator. "He's a rare chap, yon," began one, indicating the departed delegate by a jerk of his thumb towards the door. "He's getting the gift of the gab, anyhow. Aye, aye, he knows what he's about. See how he poured it into us about that there Brutus. He were pretty hard, too, to kill his own son. I could kill mine if he took part with the masters, to be sure. He's but a stepson, but that makes no odds," said another. But now tongues were hushed, and all eyes were directed toward the member of the deputation who had that morning returned to the hotel to obtain possession of Harry Carson's clever caricature of the operatives. The heads clustered together to gaze at it and detect the likenesses. "That's John Slater. I'd have known him anywhere by his big nose. Lord, how like! That's me! It's the very way I'm obligated to pin my waistcoat up to hide that I've got no shirt. That is a shame, and I'll not stand it." "Well," said John Slater, after having acknowledged his nose and his likeness, "I could laugh at a jest as well as e'er the best on 'em, though I did tell again myself, if I were not all clemmin." His eyes filled with tears. He was a poor, pinched, sharp-featured man, with a gentle and melancholy expression of countenance, and if I could keep from thinking of them at home, as is clemmin, but with their cries for food ringing in my ears and making me afeard of going home, and wonder if I should hear 'em wailing out, if I lay cold and drowned at the bottom of the canal, why, man, I cannot laugh it out. It seems to make me sad that there is any as can make game on what they've never knowed, as can make such laughable pictures on men whose very hearts within 'em are so raw and sore as ours were and are. God help us." John Barton began to speak. They turned to him with great attention. "It makes me more sad, it makes my heart burn within me, to see that folk can make a jest of striving men, of chaps who come to ask for a bit of fire for the old granny, as shivers in the cold, for a bit of bedding and some warm clothing to the poor wife who lies in labour on the damp flags, and for victuals for the childer whose little voices are getting too faint and weak to cry aloud with hunger. For, brothers, is it not them the things we ask for when we ask for more wages? We do not want dainties, we want bellyfuls. We do not want gimcrack coats and waistcoats. We want warm clothes, and so that we get 'em, we not quarrel with what they're made on. We do not want their grand houses. We want a roof to cover us from the rain and the snow and the storm. Aye, and not alone to cover us, but the helpless ones that cling to us in the keen wind, and ask us with their eyes why we brought 'em into the world to suffer." He lowered his deep voice to almost a whisper. "I've seen a father who had killed his child rather than let it clem before his eyes, and he were a tender-hearted man." He began again in his usual tone. "We come to the masters with full hearts to ask for them things I named afore. We know that they've gotten money, as we've earned for 'em. We know trade is mending, and they've large orders for which they'll be well paid. We ask for our share of the payment, for, say we, if the masters get our share of payment, it will only go to keep servants and horses, to more dress and pomp. Well and good. If you choose to be fools, we'll not hinder you, so long as you're just. But our share we must and will have. We'll not be cheated. We want it for our daily bread, for life itself, and not for our own lives neither, for there's many a one here I know by myself, as would be glad and thankful to lie down and die out of this weary world, but for the lives of them little ones who don't yet know what life is, and are afeard of death. Well, we come before the masters to state what we want, and what we must have, afore we'll set shoulder to their work, and they say no. One would think that would be enough of hard-heartedness, but it isn't. They go and make jesting pictures on us. I could laugh at myself as well as poor John Slater there, but then I must be easy in my mind to laugh. Now I only know that I would give the last drop of my blood to avenge us on yon chap who had so little feeling in him as to make game on earnest suffering men." A low, angry murmur was heard among the men, but it did not yet take form or words. John continued, "You'll wonder, chaps, how I come to miss the time this morning. I'll just tell you what I was a-doing. The chaplain at the New Bailey sent and give me an order to see Jonas Higginbotham. His was taken up last week for throwing vitriol in an obstick's face. Well, I couldn't help but go, and I didn't reckon it would have kept me so late. Jonas were like one crazy when I got to him. He said he couldn't get rest night or day for the face of the poor fellow he'd damaged. Then he thought on his weak clemmed look as he tramped footsore into town, and Jonas thought maybe he'd left them at home as would look for news, and hope and get none but haply tidings of his death. Well, Jonas had thought on these things till he could not rest, but walked up and down continually, like a wild beast in his cage. At last he bethought him on a way to help a bit, and he got the chaplain to send for me, and he telled me this, and that the man were lying in the infirmary, and who bade me go, today's the day as folk may be admitted to the infirmary, and get his silver watch, as was his mother's, and sell it as well as I could, and take the money, and bid the poor knobstick send it to his friends beyond Burnley, and I were to take him Jonas' kind regards, and he humbly asked him to forgive him. So I did what Jonas wished, but bless your life, none of us would ever throw vitriol again, at least at a knobstick. If they could see the sight I saw today, the man lay, his face all wrapped in cloths, so I didn't see that. Not a limb, nor a bit of a limb, could keep from quivering with pain. He would have bitten his hand to keep down his moans, but couldn't. His face hurt him so if he moved it e'er so little. He could scarce mind me when I telled him about Jonas. He did squeeze my hand when I jingled the money, but when I asked his wife's name, he shrieked out, "Mary! Mary, shall I never see you again? Mary, my darling, they've made me blind, because I wanted to work for you and our own baby. Oh, Mary, Mary!" Then the nurse came and said he were raving, and that I had made him worse, and I feared it was true. Yet I were loth to go without knowing where to send the money, so that kept me beyond my time, chaps. "Did you hear where the wife lived at last?" asked many anxious voices. No, he went on talking to her till his words cut my heart like a knife. I asked the nurse to find out who she was and where she lived, but what I'm more especial naming it now for is this. For one thing, I wanted you all to know why I weren't at my post this morning. For another, I wish to say that I, for one, have seen enough of what comes of attacking knobsticks, and I'll have nought to do with it no more. There were some expressions of disapprobation, but John did not mind them. "Nay, I'm no coward," he replied, "and I'm true to the backbone. What I would like, and what I would do, would be to fight the masters. There's one among you called me a coward. Well, every man has a right to his opinion, but since I've thought on the matter today, I've thought we han all of us been more like cowards in attacking the poor like ourselves, them as none to help, but mun choose between vitriol and starvation. I say we're more cowardly in doing that than in leaving them alone. No, what I would do is this. Have it the masters!" Again he shouted, "Have it the masters!" He spoke lower. All listened with hushed breath. "It's all the masters as has wrought this woe. It's the masters as should pay for it. Him as called me coward just now may try if I am one or not. Set me to serve out the masters, and see if there's out I'll stick it." "It would give the masters a bit on a fright if one of them were beaten within an inch of his life," said one. "Aye, or beaten till no life were left in it," growled another. And so with words, or looks that told more than words, they built up the deadly plan. Deeper and darker grew the import of their speeches, as they stood hoarsely muttering their meaning out, and glaring with eyes that told the terror in their own thoughts were to them upon their neighbours. Their clenched fists, their set teeth, their livid looks, all told the suffering which their minds were voluntarily undergoing in the contemplation of crime, and in familiarizing themselves with its details. Then came one of those fierce, terrible oaths which bind members of trades unions to any given purpose. Then, under the flaring gaslight, they met together to consult further. With the distrust of guilt, each was suspicious of his neighbour. Each dreaded the treachery of another. A number of pieces of paper, the identical letter on which the caricature had been drawn that very morning, were torn up, and one was marked. Then all were folded up again, looking exactly alike. They were shuffled together in a hat. The gas was extinguished. Each drew out a paper. The gas was relighted. Then each went as far as he could from his fellows, and examined the paper he had drawn without saying a word, and with a countenance as stony and immovable as he could make it. Then, still rigidly silent, they each took up their hats, and went every one his own way. He who had drawn the marked paper had drawn the lot of the assassin, and he had sworn to act according to his drawing. But no one, save God and his own countenance, knew who was the appointed murderer. End of chapter 16. Recording by Anna Daly, Washington, D.C.